Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish them, and how they market their books. We have a Facebook page called The Writer's Dream, and if you have a question for us or you would like to be on the show, please address it to the Facebook page. We are also on YouTube. We have about 120 interviews so far, so if you're a reader or a writer, you're looking for good books to read, or you're looking for advice from authors, please visit our YouTube channel and take a look at some of those tapes. Today's guest is Bernard J. Whalen, who has written two very interesting books with his dad, John Whalen. One of them is called Justifiable Homicide, and it's an interesting police thriller mystery about a mayor who gets himself into some bad trouble. And his most recent work is the NYPD's First 50 Years. And that's the history of politicians, police commissioners, and patrolmen, and it's New York City. How fascinating can it be? So tell us about your book.
Well, we'll start off with the NYPD's First 50 Years. My father and I wrote this. I'm a police officer in New York City. I've been with the department for 35 years.
You're still a police officer.
Still a police officer.
Right.
And several years ago, actually a long time ago, at the suggestion of our agent back then, we embarked on a story to tell a story about the New York City Police Department. But like most books and people who have full-time jobs, it got sidelined here and there.
Yeah.
But eventually, I came across the right agent, and he was able to sell the idea to a publisher, and we started writing again the book, and it came out this year. And the idea of it is, with a nonfiction, you have to have a theme. So the politicians, police commissioners, and patrolmen was our way to look at the police department. I've been at headquarters for a long time. I've kind of seen how it works inside. And the idea is that the politicians campaign on a crime platform in New York City, generally the mayor, but district attorneys, city council people, and whatever. And when they get in particular the mayor, he appoints a police commissioner.
Sure.
The police commissioner's job is to get the men, the patrolmen, to carry out whatever the mayor's crime platform is. And depending on the success of that platform will really determine whether or not a mayor will be reelected. Really, crime is one of the main issues in New York City and one of the main concerns for the politicians. And you see it right now if you've been reading the papers at all.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Commissioner Bratton gives some very interesting speeches.
Yeah, he's very knowledgeable, very personable, and articulate, and he's also the person who wrote the foreword for this book.
Yes. So what did he say about it?
He enjoyed it very much. I ran into him a couple weeks ago. He was giving a talk at the Holocaust Museum, and he was relating how the German police were kind of taken over by the Nazis, and they were forced to carry out the mission that the Nazis wanted to carry out. And what he was trying to relate at this Holocaust Museum is the importance of police in society and how government controls them, exactly like we talked about in this book.
I'm sure there's a lot of controversy right now on various police departments. New York and other places, and should prove to be interesting how that all turns out.
Well, he's very concerned about that. We're very concerned about that.
Sure.
For my part, sometimes I find it hard to understand, given that when I was a patrol sergeant in 1990, we had 2,700 murders a year in New York City. Yeah. We were having riots in Washington Heights, in Tompkins Square, in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. Really, things were out of control. Now we're down to 300 and change in homicides, and things are relatively quiet in the crime scene, yet they seem to be the public really seems to be getting on us a little bit more.
Well, I think that's how things work. When things are very, very bad, I think sometimes people don't know what to say, but then when things get a little better, the people feel freer to speak their minds as to what's going on. But tell us about what was happening in those first 50 years.
Just the first thing is each chapter is, the chapters are divided by mayoral administrations. So what we did is we looked at pre-1898 when there were 5 boroughs, and really it was a political decision to join the boroughs. The Democrats at Tammany Hall were in charge of Manhattan, and that was the most powerful political group in the state and probably in the country as a whole. Manhattan was probably the most wealthy area in the country. It still is. So the Republicans controlled the rest of the state, and they wanted to get in on New York City. So they came up with this scheme to merge the boroughs. And then the idea was that the outer borough population would then be able to add their votes to the disgruntled people in Manhattan and turn the city Republican. They miscalculated severely.
Terribly.
But in doing that, it then required this new police department to patrol this big city. We went from like 12 to 13 square miles of Manhattan to 320 square miles. And we needed a police department to do that. So in 1898, that's what the charter charged, I guess, the mayor with doing, and it was Van Wyck, probably one of the worst mayors, the most corrupt. He didn't even campaign. That's how powerful Tammany Hall was. He never gave a speech, went on a stump.
And they named a highway after him.
Yeah, one of the worst highways in the city.
It is.
Van Wyck. They're always jammed on it.
Yeah.
But anyways, so the smaller police departments in Staten Island, in Brooklyn, and some in Queens, in the villages like Jamaica, and College Point, Whitestone, Long Island City, they all joined, which was the old New York Police Department was within Manhattan. And basically were kind of gobbled up by the Manhattan guys. And the outer borough people weren't that happy about it because they were big fish in small ponds. Now there was people from Manhattan that really had no idea what was going on in Queens or Staten Island, and suddenly they're telling them what to do. So it took a long, long time to integrate all these departments into one.
And also the outer boroughs where, I know Queens, because I come from Queens, as you do, and Staten Island were very rural.
Very rural.
I mean, they really weren't anything like a city.
No,
maybe
not
Long
even
Island
close.
City was a little.
Yeah, not even close.
Yeah.
Most of the communities that had police back then were the waterfront communities, and also the ones that were kind of like, I guess for a lack of a better word, vacation. People would come from the city into College Point, into Whitestone. They had a park there.
The
and it was-
Rockaways.
Right. So they had their little police departments. In Long Island City, because it was across from Manhattan, they had a lot of piers. So there's a lot of shipping action.
Right.
That's where you needed police. But you really probably didn't need police in Bayside, Long Island, you know.
No.
But
A lot of rustling of cows.
right. But eventually, you know, right after that, actually, they started laying out districts that would become the precincts, pretty much what we have today.
Now, I remember that Teddy Roosevelt was the first police commissioner.
No,
Now, was this just in Manhattan before
Right.
the
So
merge?
there's a misconception about Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
Prior to having a single police commissioner, which doesn't happen right away, it happens in 1902, 1901, 1902, there was a 4-person police board.
Okay.
And 2 were Republicans and 2 were Democrats, which resulted in a constant stalemate. You couldn't do anything.
Oh, things haven't changed.
But Roosevelt happened to be the president of the police board before 1898, before the boroughs merged. But it was during his time that the plans became underway to merge the departments in the city.
So you did this, your chapters are basically the mayors as they
But we
progress
look at
through
each
time.
administration, see what they did, what was their platform, how'd they get in, who were they running against, what was that person's platform, who did they then put in to run the police department, and what happened. And then we also explored the improvements in technology. We looked at certain crimes that kind of changed the way we do things. I mean, a horrible crime, one that we profile and who the book's dedicated to. In 1940, 2 detectives were killed at the World's Fair defusing a bomb on the 4th of July. They didn't have any equipment at all. They opened a bomb, ticking bomb, and got killed. Well, after that, somebody said, you know, we got to get these guys some protective gear. We've got to come up with a way to transport these explosive devices away from the scene. I mean, at the World's Fair, there's hundreds of thousands of people. So tragedies generally caused us to develop new strategies
Right.
for things. So we look at that. We also look at the the other people that really play a role in our story, the press. You see it now. There's a saying in the newspaper business, if it bleeds, it leads. So when the police are involved, it's a front page story. Then you have, clergy, pastors, priests, people that aren't elected but have a lot of sway. And they're very often on the front page complaining about the police. Back then it was Reverend Parkhurst at the turn of the century. He was a reformer that went after us for not enforcing the blue laws on Sunday, drinking and stuff. But a lot of the immigrants wanted to drink. It was their
It
one
was
day
part of their
off.
culture.
Yeah, so we were now put in this position where if we were enforcing the rules, the public was very mad. If we didn't enforce them, these
do-gooders.
pastors, the do-gooders, the teetotalers, they were mad. But unfortunately, I don't know what's the right word, but they had a lot of control, a lot of say beyond what they really should have in some instances. So they would, get like prohibition, how that comes about, and then puts us in a position to try to stop people from drinking.
Yeah.
After they've been drinking for 100 years, 200 years.
Yeah.
It was an impossible thing to enforce.
Yes.
And when they're impossible, it leads to corruption. And that's where it comes. And then
Sure.
everybody loses confidence.
What was your favorite period? Which was your favorite administration or your favorite period in those 50 years?
Well, each one is interesting in its own right.
Or I should say that, the most interesting one to
Okay,
you.
but I would say things were different in each one. I kind of liked the teens, I guess. Things are starting to happen. Cars are starting to come. We're having our first robbery where people are using getaway cars to get away from us. And we don't have any cars to get them. So we have to buy cars and start putting them. And believe it or not, you see police cars all over the place now, but back then the guys didn't like driving cars. They were hard to drive. They didn't have any covering, so you were out in the elements. Where a guy's on his foot, he's in a doorway. He could go into a store. He could do a few things.
Right, he could duck.
Yeah, but in the car, they wanted that car out for visibility. They didn't have no radio. It wasn't like you could call the car and say, hey, be here, there's a robbery. They just had to be out there, and it was very tough on them. Also, you start getting more technology with communications in that time. Prior to that, we really didn't have that much way to get in touch. They started installing, which you still see in some places, call boxes on the pole, and the policeman would go to the call box, and they used to have lights on them. They were blinking green. And they called them the blinking Irishmen because the cops were all Irish. They had these green boxes. Everybody thinks our colors are blue, but green is the police color in New York City.
I have a neighbor across the street who's a policeman, and his little light on the garage is green.
There you go. And our old cars were green. So
Right, I remember the black and green and white.
Right. So that was coming on, but we were also then moving into World War I. And New York City, just like now, was very concerned about protecting itself. We had a lot of ships coming from all over the world. We had a huge German population in New York City, huge. As a matter of fact, I think there was more Germans than anybody in the early 1900s. So, and now we have this war over there, and we're concerned. So a lot of the things that you see today, and that was one of the themes that we reiterate in the book, as you looked at the past, you find these things coming back. The same things. We had machine guns at the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge, protecting them from saboteurs back then. So it was a very interesting time.
Your book ends in what, 1948?
46, right after World War II.
Because I had relatives who were living in Brooklyn and said they could actually see the submarines coming up in Sheepshead Bay.
Oh, I'm sure. It was all, this harbor was vital. And that's why so much was done to protect it and the crossings.
So that was going to be one of my questions. What are the themes that you see that run through the police department from its inception to now?
Well, a lot of things, and I say it in my forward in the book, that a policeman's lot is very much the same now. The technology is better, our gear is probably better, working conditions are better, But still, we're the people that are out on Sunday night, Saturday night, or at 4 o'clock in the morning, when the weather's bad and everybody's asleep. We're still there. So that hasn't changed for us. And human nature in New York City back then with Little Italy, it packed 1 million people in several square blocks. It was almost impossible to police. But eventually, and it takes time, things got better and under control. And you see that now as we have issues with whatever immigrant populations are coming in. Now, I'm confident that down the road, things will work out. But each time when it was happening, there's the same hue and outcry that you hear today about these new foreigners that are
I
coming
think
in.
that's the theme that most interests me, is the fact that it's always been multicultural in New York City.
It has been.
I've spoken to a number of friends of mine who don't live they live in the Midwest or wherever, and I say, you need to really come to New York City at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and get on the subway to understand New York City.
You'll get a show, that's for sure. But, so those are themes that we reiterate. And also, whatever the theme is of the moment is what the campaigns are usually based on for mayor. Like when Mayor de Blasio, he was able to capitalize on this stop, question, and frisk issue.
Yeah, stop and frisk.
And he generated enough interest in what he had to say that got himself elected. And then, of course, he brought in Police Commissioner Bratton. To then, if you'll see statistically, it was just in the paper, the stops are way down. Thankfully, crime is still under control.
Right.
There was concerns whether or not how it would impact.
Yes, sure.
So that's, today, back then when, we were talking about crime, one of the things that did in Mayor Mitchell, who Mitchell Field in Nassau County is named after, he only lasted 1 term. He was a reform mayor, and by all accounts, he had done a pretty good job. As police commissioner was a guy, Arthur Woods, very bright Harvard guy, but they overdid it with wiretaps. Wiretaps you were able to get them pretty easy from the phone company back then. The police commissioner would say, listen, I'm investigating a crime. I want to access this line. The phone company would say, okay. There was really no rules back then. You didn't need a warrant or anything. And they were using it to great effect because they were hearing everything that was going on. And, But when the public found out, they weren't happy about it. Even though it was